the focus I'm going to give today is going to look mainly at mainly at some of the cases I'm talking about in my book, but I'm bringing in some other cases and examples as well. And so the book looks also at evangelical Christians, but I'm going to focus for this topic on looking at Muslim Americans. And so for this topic and in the book, I'm kind of thinking about some of these binaries that you have. So you have this one dominant binary of the good Muslim, bad Muslim binary. Okay. So so most of my slides are just going to be kind of visual images that you can see, but so this good Muslim, bad Muslim binary comes, this theorization comes from Mamdani and Mahmoud Mamdani. And in this theorization, you think about how the bad Muslim is, as you see here, you know, the terrorist, the extremist, the irrational religious zealot. And the good Muslim does the work of protecting Americans from these quote unquote bad Muslims. Sorry, my light is going off in here. And religion doesn't become a major force in their life, right? And we know this binary because we see it repeated in film and TV, in the news media and popular culture. But if we go further and we look at particularly Muslim women, the bodies of Muslim women in particular are often used as symbols, or I talk about this idea of icons, of the presumed repression and backwardness of Islam. And so as Layla Abu Lagod famously argues that after 9/11, the images of, you know, burqa-clad women in Afghanistan circulated in US media and became symbols of the oppression of Islam. So the image of these women became a justification for then the Afghanistan war and American troops going in and quote unquote saving the women from the, you know, the oppression of Islam and introducing progressive Western culture. So the use of these images only reinforced the view that Muslim women are merely icons of these larger political struggles. So as Miriam Cook explains, the women are reduced to their religious and gendered identity, and she talks about how they become Muslim women. So marked by the veil, the women become one-dimensional victims of Muslim men. And so the image of the victimized Muslim woman becomes what Alia al-Saji calls a foil or a negative mirror that reflects back the presumed superiority of Western culture. So this image is used in a way to prop up and position American culture as superior. And we have these images like you see here from the TV show Homeland, where the white American is the savior of these women. And part of this is to portray Islam as inherently repressive and backward, and Western culture as essentially progressive and forward thinking. The dominant counter image to the portrayal of Muslim women as oppressed victims of Islam is the stereotype of Muslim women as hypersexualized and exotic objects of the Western male gaze. So Malika Lula has a very well regarded study where he looks at harem photography in the early 20th century, such as the image here, and looks at how the action of lifting the veil is not a genuine way to liberate Muslim women, but only an avenue to access this forbidden space under the veil. Similarly, a study of an American apparel advertisement, which was called Made in Bangladesh, author Dina Siddiqui clarifies this dichotomy that the Muslim women face. So the ad features a topless Bangladeshi woman, along with a story of how she escaped from the oppression of Bangladesh and Islam. And this ad reinforces the ideologies of liberal feminism and secular democracy, sweeping in to liberate the women. So the model in the ad has only two choices. She can remain physically covered and oppressed by Islam, or to uncover herself and be sexually liberated by Western culture. So we see here how there's this dichotomy that exists where Muslim women are either oppressed, covered, or they're liberated by Western culture, but also hypersexualized. There is no kind of in between in this situation. Excuse me. So in the face of these negative portrayals of Muslim women within Western culture, the women are also pressured from fellow Muslims to always represent Islam in a positive light. Muslim women articulating feminist critiques often feel trapped between what activist Mona Etahawi calls a rock and a hard place. So she explains in an article about her work to address sexual assault within Muslim communities, quote, "On one side are Islamophobes and racists who are all too willing to demonize Muslim men by weaponizing my testimony of sexual assault." Just a side note, she was assaulted when she was completing the Hajj pilgrimage. And continuing the quote, "On the other side is the community of fellow Muslims who are all too willing to defend all Muslim men. Neither side cares about the well-being of Muslim women." And so in this quote, she's talking about, like I said, Muslim women being caught in between, where they are sort of facing obvious stereotypes and oppression from the larger culture, but then also facing and bringing up concerns and critiques of issues within Muslim communities. And they're being told, don't bring those up because it's going to hurt and harm the community and put it in a bad, negative light. So women become icons to represent what is good and bad about Islam. But the serious concerns about gender justice within the religion are ignored. Muslim women are often discouraged from discussing within Muslim American spaces significant issues such as sexual harassment and abuse, the perpetuation of misogyny through modesty culture, and discrimination against certain Muslims based on their skin color, class, or country of origin. What my research explores is people who don't fit into these binaries, those who intentionally disrupt these binaries of good Muslim, bad Muslim, the way Muslim women are portrayed, to imagine new ways to be Muslim on one's own terms. And specifically, I look at the role of digital media in enabling this playful, hybrid, humorous expression of what it means to be a misfit Muslim and to envision a future that builds on Muslim experiences, cultures, and values. As a scholar of digital media, my research is centered on how contemporary media provide a space for feminist critiques and forming supportive communities. So digital media scholarship has long had these debates over whether online media could be a space of political activism or merely slacktivism, as we say. I don't know if you are familiar with that term, but you can see the little cartoon here. This idea that, people are just circulating content, liking content, but not really actually doing anything out in the world. And so we think about, can this have an impact? There's such a large amount of people speaking. Will these voices rise to the surface, right? Can activist movements have an impact when you have these strong political economic forces that are controlling more and more so, what people are seeing, who's benefiting, who's making money off of these platforms? So I take the approach that digital media activism can often be a space for individuals to feel themselves into larger social movements. So this is building on the work of Zizi Papacherisi, also Lynn Schofield Clark, and thinking about how online digital spaces are not necessarily activism in and of themselves, but can also often create an awareness that can lead people into larger forms of activism. Hashtags can especially be a way to show the strength of a movement and show a sense of, if you think about Me Too, the sense that, yes, I've also experienced that thing. And so to have strength in number and to also hold those in power to account. And this is building on the work of Rosemary Clark Parsons, who talks about how Me Too is a movement really to show and to hold those in power to account for larger institutional forces of inequality. And I also agree with scholars like Zeynep Tufekci, Michaela Ardizzoni, who talk about digital media as one tool within a larger toolbox that activists have, so that it's obviously not the only space, but it's part of a larger project. So in the work in the book, in Unruly Souls, building on various theories outside of kind of traditional feminist theories, so thinking about queer theory, decolonial theory, Black feminist theory, that looks at those who've been marginalized and how they find innovative opportunities for resistance through various digital media tactics. And so building on these theories, I assert that the women are able to effectively deploy their disregarded status as unruly, as misfits, along with digital media tactics to construct a new religious understanding, excuse me, built on the equality of all people in the eyes of God. So in the book, I'm especially working with this concept of the oppression and the forms of discrimination that these individuals face goes to a deeper level because it's often based in religious ideas. So it's often based in people being told that they are impure or unruly or sinful, and that it's based in these ideas that you are less than in the eyes of God. And so a lot of the projects that I'm looking at are ways for people to assert their value and their sort of deep value in being created equal in the eyes of God. And so I often look at the hybrid and malleable aspects of digital media and the way that how they complement the unruly, queer, and contradictory activism that is brewing among a lot of young Americans, but particularly young Muslims. And so one example, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, is the work of Mona Haider, who is a hip hop artist, and how in this video, which is called Barbarian, which we'll look a little bit at later, she deliberately transforms the exoticized labels that we talked about with the harem photography that are applied to Muslim American women. And instead, she celebrates being a barbarian, right? Celebrates this exoticization and turns it on its head and uses it in a different way. And it's done very playfully. And that's what we'll discuss. So these feminist activists engage in these small tactics of resistance in digital media in order to contest problematic religious teachings around sexuality, around race, around gender roles. So along with addressing social injustices, they also build supportive spaces for those who are trying to recover from these forms of religious trauma. So to give you a sense of some of the theories I'm building on, one, obviously, is intersectional feminism, and specifically Black feminism, but also looking at work of Chicana feminism, the work of Lisa Flores, who's a communication scholar. She talks about how, those, she was looking at Chicana women, which are people who are trace their ancestry to Mexico, basically. So they are kind of caught in between because, similar to what we were saying with Muslim women, that they didn't really find a space of home within white feminism because it's too much focus on whiteness, but then also didn't find a space within the Chicano communities because there was kind of a hyper masculinity in those spaces. And so how they use culture to create kind of a space of their own. And she talks about this discursive space of belonging. And so really intersectionality, I think, fits in with my work because I'm looking at those whose identities fall in between these binaries, in between these labels, and how they're seeking to create their own spaces of belonging. I'm also building on decolonial theory and some of the work of Homi Bhabha, particularly the concept of mimicry. I find really useful in a lot of these projects because it looks at how the colonized subjects are caught in between the local culture and the culture of the colonizer. And so mimicry is a way of kind of subverting the culture of the colonizer by kind of pointing to some of the flaws within that culture. And so pointing out the flaws in Western arguments while still borrowing from Western culture in productive ways. And we'll look at this specifically again with the Barbarian video. Also the concept of disidentification, which is from Jose Esteban Munoz, really building on queer theory. And in this case, he's looking at those who are kind of in marginal and queer positions and how they resist dominant culture by reading against the dominant narrative. And so instead of identifying with or resisting the dominant narrative, disidentification is a way to kind of read oneself into the story and kind of change it and offer innovative alternate readings from within a marginal perspective. And then, as I said, Black feminism is really influential, particularly the work of bell hooks and this idea of an oppositional gaze, which again is kind of similar to disidentification of reading an alternate story into culture, right? And so a lot of times the oppositional gaze is someone who looks back, but also someone who refuses to take pleasure in mainstream culture and instead becomes what Sarah Ahmed calls feminist killjoy. So one who always is bringing a critical eye to these spaces of enjoyment. And so a lot of the women in these cases are taking on this role of a feminist killjoy and refusing to be sort of positive, happy icons of Islam, right? And instead, they're bringing up deep problems of misogyny, racism, colorism, classism, harassment within religious communities and within larger American society. And finally, the work of Stuart Hall, the cultural theorist, is really important here because thinking about this idea of speaking back and articulating a different meaning, right? So for Muslim Americans, there's so much in the culture that is sort of putting and applying labels onto their bodies, right? Onto certain symbols like the hijab. And in this case, looking at digital activism as a space for individuals to re-articulate, and especially to re-articulate their inherent value as beautiful souls, as beautiful individuals created by God. Okay. So that gives you a little sense of some of the theories that I'm working with here. Now I'm going to go into a few of the case studies and examples. So we'll look at some images. So the first one I want to talk about is the work on Instagram, and particularly Islamic fashion and images of Muslim women in Instagram. So American Muslim communities often are going to emphasize the importance of maintaining sexual purity until marriage and the need for women to maintain modesty for the community. And so again, this idea of being an icon. And so the way Muslim women appear is sort of representative of the larger community. So not wanting to make the community look bad, but also this idea of like maintaining the modesty for the community. So preventing men from sinning. And I argue in this chapter that these high standards of modesty and piety are often reinforced in the space of Islamic fashion, and especially in the visual space of a platform like Instagram. And so if you just do a quick search for hijabi or Muslim fashion on Instagram, the majority of images will look like this. And as you see, there is a particular kind of style and icon that is being promoted here. They promote this idea that a woman must reflect kind of Western beauty standards, right? So generally thin, light complected, but then there's this modesty where it's the kind of the flowing clothes, and at the same time, being kind of a passive representative of Islam. So not really being too in your face, not really talking about political issues, just kind of being this beautiful icon that people can look at and kind of can imitate in that way. And so it's always kind of being this positive, glowing image of Islam. And so in this chapter, in this work, I look at 4 different women who in very different ways are kind of counteracting this dominant style. And so what I look at is how the women all engage with the stylistic expectations of Instagram. So in different ways, they're playing by the rules in some ways of Instagram, of it being about beautiful images, right? And fashion, domestic. But they're kind of cleverly inserting critiques or inserting Islamic values or inserting feminist values into these spaces in very different ways. So we'll look at a few of these examples. So the first example is Leah Vernon. So as you can see here, this is some of her images. She identifies online as fat Black Muslim woman. So that's kind of the categories that she identifies as. And she really wants to visually contest what is acceptable as beautiful, and consequently whose lives and whose bodies are valued. And so she deliberately is trying to counteract what she calls the pastel social media influencer, or the pastel hijabi aesthetic. And so as you can see in her images, she often uses bold, bright, primary colors. She is not afraid to wear clothing that is form-fitting, that shows her curves, that draws attention to her body, right? And she often in her pictures takes up a lot of space, right? She doesn't want to be the the fat person who feels like you have to hide who you are. She wants to insert her body into this space. So the other thing that she does, along with focusing on her large body and her very bold style, is she talks about various forms of intersectional oppression in her captions. And I think it really fits into what I was talking about with the oppositional gaze and the feminist killjoy, because rather than making this just a space for people to consume and find these beautiful images and be comforted, she's bringing in these critiques. So she'll talk about racism. She'll talk about fat phobia. She'll talk about Islamophobia. She very openly talks about mental health struggles that she has. She will talk about the challenges that there are in doing this work of an influencer. Very few influencers will ever talk about, how difficult it is financially to be an influencer. And she will discuss that and address that. And so she, like I said, she's really inserting her body, her political issues, not just her political issues, but larger social political issues into these spaces. And she even will say, like, does my body upset you? Does it make you uncomfortable? Like, why might that be, right? So she's even challenging people to think differently about this. Another woman that I look at is Blair Imani, who is actually one of the most popular Muslim American influencers on Instagram. She does really unique work in order to educate followers, and she focuses on progressive causes. So she's fitting into this work on Instagram of being sort of an educator. So she posts a lot of content about, progressive causes, various, background history. So it might be, we just had, Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States in October. So she might have a post about, the history of that holiday and the history of Christopher Columbus. So kind of focusing on those political progressive issues. But she also posts, kind of typical fashion lifestyle content. She also identifies as Black, queer, and Muslim. And like I said, she still kind of posts a lot of these traditional influencer posts, but also she brings in her own, personal experiences of, Islamophobia or experiences being a queer Muslim and critiques that she gets from fellow Muslims about that. But like I said, she still creates these very well-composed, aesthetically attractive, and content that's fairly pleasurable to consume. Okay. This woman is Zainab bint Yunus, and the image of her on the right side. I'm not sure if maybe Anna talked about her work, because I know she's done some work on Zainab as well. But she uses her Instagram page in a really unique way. She creatively promotes a very Islamic aesthetic style, and she posts book reviews. This is a popular thing called Bookstagram. But she posts obviously book reviews of either Islamic texts, like nonfiction type of theology books, or she posts a lot of fantasy books. She's really into like fantasy and sci-fi, comics, children's books. She posts a lot about, young adult books, but all from either Muslim authors or talking about, having sort of an Islamic approach in the books. She also posts pictures of her domestic space, as you can see here. So she'll have these like beautifully, designed, bookshelves and corners of her house, or these beautiful plants, or her space where she prays. And oftentimes they will incorporate Islamic images, Islamic art, calligraphy, kind of, as you can see here, like the geometric style to Islamic art. And so rather than paying kind of vapid or sexualized attention to the human body, which is what a lot of Instagram is, Zainab uses the styles and tools of Instagram to focus on her faith and to highlight the deep beauty of Islamic art and culture. So she wears the niqab face veil, as you can see in this picture. So she obviously never shows her face, but she rarely posts self-portraits. This picture is actually not from her Instagram. It's from something else. And I think that she really reflects this tactic of mimicry that I talked about, because she's really effortlessly embracing Western visual aesthetics of Instagram. So she is very aware that these kind of nice, soft home domestic spaces do well on Instagram, right? She posts a lot of pictures of beautiful baked goods and, you know, lovely plants and things like that. So she knows those things are going to track and are going to go through the algorithm and spread. But at the same time, her posts are really rejecting Western values and the focus on the body and the face. And instead, she's celebrating the superiority of Islamic styles and of religious values. Okay. And then the last individual is Angelica Lindsay Ali, who goes by the name the Village Auntie. And she creates a really unique space on Instagram. She's like an Islamic sex educator. So she teaches courses for women about sexuality, about their bodies from an Islamic perspective. And so she creates this space to really share knowledge with a female audience, and also really celebrating non-Western beauty standards and different body shapes, as you can see here. And again, she creates this very beautiful, comforting, kind of natural space. Excuse me. But at the same time, uses Islamic teachings and incorporates those into this space. Okay. So I'm going to move on and talk about digital music videos. And so in this chapter, I'm kind of thinking through how music videos provide kind of this hybrid space. And I'm building off of larger hip hop culture and how hip hop music in particular allows for this kind of overlap and hybridity and layering, especially if you think about hip hop music is essentially about bringing different things together. So you sample from different music and then you layer in the rap lyrics and different types of music into it. And so it can be a really productive space. And a lot of early female hip hop artists were very political and were really a lot about talking about various forms of oppression that they faced and how they were also kind of caught in between, where they were, you know, obviously, well, they were facing oppression from larger American society because most of these individuals were Black or Latino. And so they were facing a lot of discrimination in American society. But at the same time, a lot of the male hip hop artists were rapping about, you know, very misogynistic ideas. So they were faced with kind of being caught in between, right? And a lot of these women did some really creative work to kind of speak back, right, to both the men in their community, but also to speak back to the larger American society. And so I look in this chapter at how Muslim American women, but also I look at men as well, use the hybridity of hip hop to really kind of speak back and to really deconstruct these binary thinking. And I think a lot of it relates to mimicry, relates to rearticulation, to not just respond to Islamophobia, but to really celebrate their culture, to confront issues within Muslim communities, and to imagine a future for Muslims that breaks free of these binaries and these various labels. So the hijabi video, which maybe people have seen, was the first video from Mona Haider. Has gotten, I think, like 7 or 8 million views at this point. And this video, she talks about how this is meant to be kind of an anthem for Muslim women, that it wasn't meant to be speaking to non-Muslims. It was meant to be a space for Muslim women to kind of be celebrated and to feel a sense of community, that women of, as it says, every shading in the song, of all body shapes, women who are covered or not, all feel a sense of identity and connection. And the digital spread of this video allowed Muslim women to kind of add on and to share in this expression of unity. So to share memes or quotes or things from this video. And really, I think this relates to what I talked about with Lisa Flores, this creating a discursive space of belonging. So using the music video, using the digital space to create a sense of community and belonging. Okay. The other video that I want to talk about, the next video was a video called Dog. And this was a very critical video that she released where she was specifically addressing hypocrisies within Muslim American communities and how Muslim leaders, as you can see here in one of the lyrics, she says, sheikhs on the DL, so on the down low, like behind the scenes, shakes in my DMs and my direct messages are begging me to shake it on my cam in the PM, right? So this idea that these sheikhs, these religious teachers, are telling me, oh, you're so sinful, you're not being pious enough, you're not modest enough. But then on the down low, in secret, they're harassing women and even assaulting women. And so she used this song to really call out the problems of misogyny and sexual harassment and abuse within Muslim communities. And what's unique in this video is she uses humor and confidence to critique those in positions of power, but she doesn't re-traumatize the victims, which I think is an important aspect of this video, that it's not meant to be a video where people are going to watch it and feel like that it's going to traumatize them for things that they've experienced, but instead it allows the women to feel a sense of like taking down these hypocritical male leaders. And so you can see in some of the quotes here, the way that she is, really using some of the language that is applied to Muslim women. So this gets into this idea of disidentification. So she's using the language that is often used to denigrate Muslim women. You're haram, you're turning me on. And instead, she's turning this around and she's saying, no, you're the one that is actually the problem. You're the one who needs a Quran. You're the one who needs, as she says here, an exorcist, right? And so she uses humor, she uses playful language, which is allowed, enabled by hip hop music. But she uses this to call out these individuals for their hypocrisy. So here's a few other kind of silly quotes. And I think a big part of this is she's not necessarily saying that she cares if the men have money or have successful jobs, but she's saying that the men care about those things. So she's kind of poking at them in this case. Okay. All right, let's look at the barbarian video, and hopefully we can watch the video will work and you'll be able to hear it. Excuse me. So I think this video is a perfect illustration of the way haters work is a form of mimicry and rearticulation. Because in this video, she embraces and celebrates the negative stereotypes that are often applied to colonized bodies as savage, exotic, barbarian. And at the same time, the video points to the flaws within Western American and Euro-American culture. So I think I'll play it and hopefully this will work.
They're civilized. I'd rather stay savage. Arrogant, beautiful and stare at them. First shake your rattling. Don't be wild out loud again. We got barbarians, jasmine and frankincense, feminine in them. Beautiful barbarian. On these big lips, but they used to hate. Now the sweet lips. Okay, they got them. DJ, 100 votes. That's what I'm on. I'm a savage, then go raw. My chain's off. Won't be long. See me glowing. Look at God. That's so eloquent. I'm humble, intelligent. You're being standard irrelevant. A revolution.
Okay, so maybe the audio quality is not as good. I'm not sure how it's coming through, but you can all on your own time, you can watch the video and get a sense of some of the lyrics. And also, I think it's helpful too to read through the lyrics, which she provides on the videos as well. But in this, I mean, you can see the visuals, which I think is also really relevant. I mean, in this video, she employs the visual beauty of various styles. And she told the women in this, if I can go back, you can see basically to wear whatever they felt represented kind of their cultural background. So you try to find the one image where you see all the women. And you see here this outdoor image where, here we go. So she told the women, bring whatever you would like to wear that kind of represents your own cultural traditions. And then she has these images of her in the outdoor environment, eating with her fingers, and doing the things that are sort of seen as like exotic, right? And if you think of like harem paintings, you have these images of the women reclining and sort of in outdoor settings, right? So again, what she's doing is celebrating being a barbarian, as she says here, we them barbarians, beautiful and scaring them, earth shaking, rattling, be wild out loud again. And so in the song and the written commentary, she questions who the real savage is. If you look at, US government and the things that have been done in the, in the pursuit of freedom, quote unquote, right? And so she's talking about, like you started a war over oil fields and for poppy seeds and all these things, right? So she's kind of calling out, like, as she says at the beginning, if you're civilized, I'd rather stay savage. So basically saying, if that's what it means to be civilized, that's not really what I would like, right? And so this is part of this critique that she's really celebrating what's been denigrated. The next one, I don't know if the audio will work, but maybe I'll just play it and you can maybe I can play it and you can like look at the visuals of this as I'm speaking. So this is a project that's called Alhamdu. And this is a multimedia project that featured a video, music, images, fashion, art, and it was all focused around this theme of Muslim futurism. And this was created by the Mipsters Art Collective. And basically, it's kind of like a fashion video, but then the song, I won't play the song because it'll probably be hard to hear, but it's a hip hop song and it kind of repeats this idea of Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillah. So it's building on, Islamic ideas, but then it's also sampling, hip hop culture. It's sampling various Arab beats. And then in the video, you see kind of the layering of fashion styles, the kind of blending and hybridity of this, right? And so it really reflects kind of this third culture that a lot of these participants feel, being both American, but also having these cultural traditions that they're bringing from their parents, right? From their families. And so blending kind of hip hop with these various cultural styles. And kind of being playful in a lot of ways, as you can see. And they talked about wanting this video and the fashion style to be very gaudy, kind of in your face, overly, excessive in the layering and various things like this. So like in the Barbarian video, the participants really want to embrace these kind of Orientalist stereotypes in an effort to showcase their beauty. And they're also building on this idea of futurism. So often it's like Afrofuturism and thinking about what it means to be Black and African, moving beyond, the limitations of this planet, of the current times, right? And so the creators of this movement, Abbas Ratani and Sarah Alfagi, they talk about Muslim futurism as, quote, a cultural and artistic aesthetic that reimagines an American Muslim future free from the confines of Orientalism and the language of the majority culture, end quote. And so this project is a way for Muslims to really simply exist on their own terms, unapologetically, and to create something purely for their own enjoyment, for fun, to just celebrate these various aspects of Islamic culture. The last thing I want to look at is the West Muslim Girl. This was a popular online magazine for young Muslim women. It's maybe less popular now, but at its peak, it was extremely popular, and it really illustrates kind of the intersectionality of the Muslim American experience. Again, I think it can be kind of this discursive space of belonging for Muslim women. So I did a content analysis of this site from 2015 to 18, and I was looking at, what are the topics that the website is covering. So I found that around 50% of the articles were actually about political topics, which is kind of surprising because the site appears to be sort of like a fashion lifestyle magazine for young Muslim women. But instead, a lot of the articles were talking about political issues. There was around 19% were about religious topics, 22% were about lifestyle, fashion, beauty, nutrition, and then about 9% were about culture, so popular culture, music, film, things like that. So this is just a little bit of a chart. This is from a chapter that I worked on, and you can see here that the articles often address political issues, but in the first few years, so around the time of Trump's election and then moving into, his campaign and then moving into his election, a lot of the topics were about issues that faced Muslims who were particularly either Arab or South Asian Muslims. So things like harassment, hate speech, things that they experienced like at the airport screenings, and immigration issues, refugees, foreign policy. But then from the summer of 2017 onward, an interesting shift happened where a lot of the topics started to be more about intersectional issues. And so they would be about things like how Muslims' experiences overlapped with anti-Black racism, or how they overlapped with LGBTQ issues, or how they related to the experiences of Latinos. So these were things that started to come up, and it was definitely a shift that happened where there was much more of this intersectional kind of consciousness raising of how Muslim Americans from more Arab and South Asian backgrounds related to other experiences of oppression. And so I kind of argue that the kind of interstitial, flexible nature of digital media enabled some of this activism and networking to happen, where young Muslims were also becoming more interested in larger forms of oppression rather than sort of the individual or the smaller community experiences. And so while social media can certainly create these kind of silos where people are kind of only concerned with their own issues, there's also the potential for the networking nature of social media to allow for this connections with other issues, and for people to even post an article that is about something that's completely unrelated to Muslims, but is about, say, anti-Blackness, and for people to feel a sense of like, this is an issue that we should care about and be concerned about. Okay. So some of the articles talked about, simply about intersectional feminism and bringing on these critiques of, white feminism and how that is very narrow, right? And so this article talks about, feminism is not just about white women. It's not just about kind of empowerment feminism, wearing a cool, empowering t-shirt, but it's actually about thinking about things like the sweatshop factory that produced the t-shirt, right, that you're wearing. And so the statements emphasize that feminism needs to be about justice for all, and not prioritizing white, wealthy, straight women above others. As I mentioned, racism and colorism was a very prominent topic on this platform. And a lot of Black Muslims talking about their experiences that they've had of racism within Muslim communities. So Leah Vernon had an article in there where she talks about her own experience. And then also this one woman, I'm trying to remember her name, Amal Matan, talks about how Black Muslim women face discrimination because of their religion, their race, and their gender, but are often not accepted or valued in Muslim spaces. And she particularly in this kind of critiques Muslim Americans who are very concerned with fitting into American culture and being overly respectful, that they embrace white supremacist interpretations of Islam. I know this is also something that is talked about in Sylvia Chan Malik's work of looking at, the kind of dichotomy between certain Muslims based around race. Some articles talked about Latino Muslims, but these generally were mostly about how Latino Muslims were often assumed to be Arab Muslims because of how they looked. But there wasn't really so much about how they faced any form of discrimination within the Muslim community. There are a few articles that looked at colonization and issues of indigenous people. And so again, these are examples of where Islam is not even really mentioned in these articles, but it's more just calling to mind and attention how colonization is this larger project that harms lots of different people. And so Muslims are implicated in that, but so are lots of other people as well. Or I should say Muslims are victimized by that as well. There were some articles that looked at LGBTQ concerns, particularly personal experiences of being queer and being Muslim. And then there were also some really well-written articles that looked at reproductive rights and looked at how this, there's this article in particular offered a really insightful argument against how some Americans tend to, both conservatives and progressives, interestingly enough, often will use Sharia law as a way to imply something is like backwards or conservative. And so they'll say like, oh, like the abortion bans are Sharia law, right? And this article offers a really useful critique of basically saying that when you use Sharia law, you're not only misunderstanding Islamic traditions and the teachings around whether abortion is allowed, because it generally is allowed up until, like the quickening or up until about 20 weeks. But it also really is ignoring the ways that patriarchal interpretations of Christianity is actually what's being used to promote abortion bans. And so it's a really kind of complex intersectional feminist critique is offered in this piece. Okay, and so Muslim Girl in general is a website that looks at how various issues of injustice expand out and aren't just concerns for Muslim Americans. They relate to larger concerns of racism, socioeconomic issues, reproductive rights, criminal justice reform, climate change, colonialism. And so all these various issues, this is a space to kind of raise various concerns that Muslim women are facing oppression that relates to larger issues of oppression, and how the digital space can enable these networks and these connections. Okay. So just some concluding thoughts, we can kind of have a conversation. So my work has kind of explored this intersectional feminist activism among Muslim Americans within these digital spaces. And so some themes that kind of emerge. One is really thinking about how activism has moved beyond just experiences of Islamophobia and looking more at how individual oppression relates to larger intersecting structures of oppression that extend beyond religious spaces. And I think definitely during the Trump administration, a lot of this came to light, where you see, the anti-Islam laws really fitting and connecting with other forms of discrimination and anti-immigration. So these forms of oppression may exist within religious communities, such as domestic violence, sexual abuse, racism, and anti-queerness. But Muslim Americans are also aware of how their experiences of oppression in American culture relate to these larger issues. And so these activist projects that are often trying to root out misogyny and white supremacy within religious institutions go deeper than holding people in power to positions of account. Rather, the activists articulate the ways that religious leaders have misinterpreted the scriptures and are defiling faith communities by ignoring foundational teachings of justice and equality within Islam. So you can see that especially like in the work of Mona Haider and Dog, where she's basically calling out Muslim leaders for misinterpreting the teachings. And also this online work, I explore more in the book how it does more to address this deep harm of it being religious trauma. And so how there's a need for people to develop these spaces for healing, particularly for the people who are harmed by these teachings. So not only do these people feel marginalized in their communities because of their intersecting identities, but they also feel like outsiders in non-religious context as well, because they grew up in these niche communities. So something like if somebody identifies as a queer Muslim, they feel a sense of oppression and judgment within Islam. But then also if they go to like a secular queer space, they don't necessarily relate to people who haven't had the particular religious experience. And so some of these online spaces allow people to really celebrate what it means to be Muslim and queer at the same time. So digital media obviously has limitations, but I think these examples show the ways that Muslim creatives engage with the playfulness, the hybridity of digital media to articulate their inherent value and create a new future that's really built on being a Muslim misfit and not fitting into these binary good Muslim, bad Muslim categories. So one thing I want to just close with are, these are some images that were shared as part of the Alhamdu project on Muslim futurism. So these were Instagram stories that feature quotes from various participants in the project. And I think these quotes illustrate these ideas that I'm getting at of living unapologetically, right, as a Muslim, of reclaiming our identities and moving beyond the boundaries of what it means to be Muslim. And really this idea of rearticulation, of rearticulating what it means to be Muslim and celebrating one's value. So really embracing this playful nature of digital media to develop these supportive faith communities that are really built on a foundation of queerness, hybridity, unruliness, and sort of imagining what it means to be Muslim beyond these binaries, beyond these categories.